Welcome to tonight's Red and NYC live stream event. I am Carly Iacono, First Vice President Investments with Marcus and Millichap, and I am very honored tonight to be joined by Governor Patterson and Harry Dublinsky. Tonight will be a very engaging evening, so I'm going to do a brief introduction of both of our esteemed guests and then let Harry and Governor David Patterson jump into the content. So this really requires no introduction, but I will give you some of the highlights of David Patterson's esteemed career in politics and in business. Prior to becoming New York State's 55th governor in March of 2008, he began his political career when he was elected to represent Harlem in 1985 at the age of 31, making him the third youngest state senator in New York's history. In 2002, he was elected as minority leader of the New York State Senate, becoming the first African-American and blind legislative leader in the state's history. Among his many other accomplishments and distinctions, he was honored to address the 2004 Democratic National Convention. In 2014, he was appointed chairman of the New York State Democratic Party and served on the board of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Today, David is a senior vice president and a senior advisor to the president and COO at Sands Las Vegas. Welcome, Governor Patterson. Thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you, Carly. It's great to be here.
We are also joined by Harry Dublinsky. Harry is a principal at the Wilson Park Group, which is a strategic financial advisory firm. He is a CPA with 25 years experience in New York City, dealing with real estate, family offices, high net worth individuals, and startups. So without further ado, welcome, gentlemen. Let's jump into tonight's content.
Thank you so much, Carly. Thank you, Selman Yalcin from REDinNYC, and thank you to our Alpha Hunters Network. It's a great pleasure to welcome my longtime colleague, David Patterson, the 55th governor of New York, to reflect on his recently published memoir, Black, Blind, and in Charge, and to add his keen insights on this heated election season, dealing with COVID-19, restarting New York's economy, dealing with large government deficits, something that he knows quite well, the new upcoming New York City mayoral race, and race relations. Governor, it's good to see you again. Congratulations on your new book. What motivated you, I know you for quite a while, to actually write your memoir at this time?
Well, they tried to get me to write it about a month after I became governor, and I had to tell them I'm a little busy right now. I can't get to that. Then when I left the governor's office in 2011, I honestly didn't think it was a good time for me to write because I was kind of frustrated at having gone head to head with so many former friends of mine who just couldn't understand why it was so important to balance the budget during the years 2008, 2009, and 2010. Those are the years that I was governor. And now 10 years later, everybody tells me, you did the right thing. We were behind you. Well, I didn't see too many people behind me at the time, but I was relieved to hear that had we not closed the $40 billion deficit that the state had over those 3 years, and then an additional $10.2 billion was closed by Governor Andrew Cuomo his first year. And then ever since then, New York has had the lowest tax rate than it's had since 1952. So we're pretty happy that we were able to do that. But there were so many interesting experiences I had. And, when I would talk to reporters or talk to friends, and sometimes, Harry, when you and I would have lunch or dinner, and I tell you some of these stories, people would say to me, you ought to write a book. So I decided I would do it, and this is the result of it.
That's great. For the benefit of our audience, can you please take us back to that called the Fateful Day, March 17, 2008, when you became governor and was effectively in charge of the state?
Well, I was riding up to Albany, and I got to the office around 10 o'clock, and then they told me that the governor couldn't go to a family planning event at 11 o'clock. They told me this about 20 minutes before, and they wanted me to take his place. And I complained that I wasn't given more notice and that I was busy at the moment. Lieutenant governors are never busy. And so, but just trying to demonstrate some pride in the work that I did do, I told them that I really would have appreciated more notice. I was actually going to the event anyway, so I didn't have to rehearse or anything. I knew what I was going to say and came back. And then around 12:30, I get a call from my chief of staff, and he says that the governor is ready to meet, was scheduled to meet with the cardinal and all the bishops at 1:30, but the governor's late. He's not going to be in Albany, and he wants you, David, to take his place. And I said to Charles O'Byrne, who was my chief of staff, Charles, that is a head of state to head of state meeting. You can't breach that relationship. That would be as if the Queen of England came to Washington to see President Bush, and the president's a little busy, so he sends Dick Cheney. And so I said, although in that case, it might have been appropriate in that case, since Cheney, I thought, was running the government. In this case, it would not be appropriate. And they're still trying to get me to take this meeting. And it's kind of like in a movie where everyone watching the movie knows the peril that the protagonist is in, but the individual himself or herself has no idea what's about to happen to them. So at 10 after 1, I get a call from the governor's secretary, Richard Baum. He's whispering because he's in the governor's bathroom in his Fifth Avenue apartment, and tells me that the governor has been caught in sort of a prostitution string, and he will be having to resign. So I asked Mr. Baum, when will he be resigning? He said it's at about 2:15. I said, well, what time is it now? He said 1:15. So I thought, wow, I have a whole hour to set up a transition team and create a new staff and come up with new policies. And so it was pretty shocking. Fortunately for me, the governor's wife forbid him to resign that particular day. She was not really able at that point to really recognize that there was no future for him. And that extra couple of days before the actual resignation gave me a chance to at least compose some remarks that we later called my inauguration speech.
That's great. And who were some of the politicians that you would say were the most supportive of this transition effort?
I would say every single senator and assembly member in Albany. When I was introduced as the new governor on March 17th, 2008, there was a crescendo. And I would love to tell you, Harry, it's because of the great work I did or my lovely personality. But half of it was that I had worked with all of these people for nearly 21 years at that point, but also they all had individual difficulties with the governor. So it was a combination of, oh, we know David Patterson, and ding dong, the witch is dead.
Now turning to our, look, we're 5 days away from what many are calling, again, the most important election of a lifetime. Can you please share your perspective on this heated contest and get the major divide that we have in this country?
Well, there's so much acrimony in this country right now that we have thought up ways to divide ourselves that we would never have considered before. We're now divided over the wearing of masks. We're divided over whether or not to listen to the CDC. We're divided on any statement that someone from the opposite party makes has to be labeled outrageous or ridiculous. And we are divided over the fact that we have a growing pandemic where more and more lives are at risk, where now 70,000 people a day are acquiring the virus right here in the United States. And at the same time, the longer that our businesses are closed, our restaurants are not filled to capacity, the longer that we're not doing commerce, the greater budget deficit we're getting ourselves into. This year, we had a supply shock and a demand shock at the same time. I don't think that's ever happened before. We had a supply shock right in the beginning of the pandemic when people were actually warehousing toilet paper, when they were raiding the supermarkets, when supermarkets were restricting the sales of products just to try to be fair to all their customers. Then we have had a continuing demand shock because people are not leaving their homes. They're working from home. They're not traveling around the city and stopping. No money is being spent on transportation. No money is being spent on any kind of commerce. No one's money is really spent on entertainment values, and it's killing our economy. And I can honestly say that whichever direction you go in, you're going to have to deal with the fallout from the other.
Right. Yes. So again, shifting it into COVID-19, during last week's debate, you have the president declaring that the cure can't be worse than the disease. You need to learn how to live with it. Then Joe Biden states, we're about to go into this dark, long winter, and people are not learning how to live with COVID, but tragically are dying with it. How do you start to reconcile these different positions? How do you develop a constructive medium that safeguards physical, mental, and economic health?
Well, this may come as a surprise, but the president did something that on some level I understood. He did not want to send the nation into a panic. But by doing so, he wanted to reopen the government on April 12th when they only closed it on the second week of March. And his cure was to do nothing. So in his case, the cure was worse than the disease because the states had to individually start closing down because of the threat to life itself. Now, where I come from, the first value has got to be the preservation of human life. That's why in military, we don't leave soldiers on the field. And that's why in healthcare situations, we don't leave victims on the field. So in that respect, I don't know what he's talking about. What he's saying is that keeping the government closed is hurting the economy. But the reality is we're not closing the government because we feel like it or because it's a democratic policy. We're closing it because it's been proven that the wearing of masks, the practice of social distancing, testing, and tracing have reduced the virus. It did in New York, where we had 800 deaths in New York on Easter Sunday, and then wound up with no deaths just 2 months later per day. It's back. It's spiked a little since then, but we found a way to create to limit the virus. No one has a cure. No one has a magic wand or a vaccine that's guaranteed to work. And I think the use of vaccines is being overblown. We have a vaccine for the flu every year. It only works in 30% of the cases. So I think that the president, in trying to downplay the virus, yet has not stopped talking about the virus. So I think he's creating a problem for himself if he's trying to get reelected. Biden, on the other hand, he has not exactly brought the world down in harmonious celebration of his tremendous character or great ability. But like a lot of other candidates, such as George Pataki, who ran for governor of New York in 1994, and George Herbert Walker Bush, who ran for president in 1988, sometimes all you have to do is stand there and let the other person beat themselves. I have no idea who's going to win this race. I do not believe that Biden is a sure shot. I think it's going to be very close. And in a matter of, after today, 4 days, we're going to find out who that new president will be.
Right. And just talking about New York State, New York leadership, how do you rate and contrast the performance of Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio during this crisis?
Well, I thought Governor Cuomo was dynamic. He was articulate. He took the stage 112 days in a row. He not only covered the issues of healthcare, he had to lecture the federal government on the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. He talked to families about how they should interact with each other and his family. With him on, who needed Dr. Phil? They could have given him the whole time off while Governor Cuomo was speaking to us for over an hour every day for 112 days. Mayor de Blasio, I think, certainly has tried to make a difference, but there have been certain points this year when he defended the police after they were attacked in some of the rioting after the killing of George Floyd. The mayor made some very strong statements and was attacked from the further left of his own party. These are times when you're a leader that you have to stake out a position and stick to it. You can't back away and start talking about defunding the police because people criticize that you defended the police. And I thought he really lost a lot of ground, even with the number of people who support him by doing that. So my feeling is that Governor Cuomo distinguished himself in the next few years, I think we'll feel what that distinguished quality may produce. And I think Governor Murphy of New Jersey did a good job, but there were a lot of elected officials who I thought could have comported themselves a little better during this virus and this epidemic.
And by the way, do you think the mayor's going to approve the sale of the Mets to Steve Cohen?
Well, what's interesting is that the prerequisite is that the person has committed a crime and been convicted or some serious act of moral turpitude. I don't know that Steve Cohen has done either in that particular case. I also don't know to what extent this is Mayor de Blasio speaking in these articles that were printed today, as much as it's the people who were against the sale, the A-Rod and the group he was putting together with his wife, and then also the Post doesn't like Steve Cohen, so it'd be easy to write this. I think very rarely the city has this opportunity in many situations. It has never executed the right to try to hold something up such as this before, and certainly there would have to be some contribution from the controller to do that. I think the sale will go through, and so it can end another headache that we Met fans have, which is usually a daily occurrence, except in the great period where there's no baseball for 6 months.
Right. Talking about New York City has recently been taking quite a bit of pot shots. No longer perhaps saluted as the gateway city to the world, rather the president referred to it as a ghost town. Mayor de Blasio was quick to remind us that Manhattan is not the center of the universe, rather the 5 boroughs and the communities that make up the people live in. Given this backdrop, what advice would you give our elected officials and aspiring mayoral candidates in kickstarting the local economy, bringing the city back, dealing with the huge looming government deficits? Well, what advice would you give them?
Everybody is going to see the recovery of the pandemic as a shared sacrifice. Everybody must see it that way. Now, in 2008, when I had to cut $21.3 billion in the highest escalation of a budget deficit experienced by a state in 1 year in United States history, when I did it, at a certain point, I had to implement a $12 billion tax over 3 years. Governor Cuomo, fortunately, when the economy improved, was able to cut that in half in last year. And, there will probably be somewhat of a tax increase. At the same time, a legislative committee came up with 5 revenue raisers for getting out of the pandemic, and all of them were taxes, and all of them seemed to hit the very wealthy. 1% of New Yorkers pay about 39% of the overall taxes. These people are in a much different position than they were 12 years ago when I set the taxes. The size and power of technology is so exponential that they can literally live in other states, fly in when they need to do business in New York in the Central Business District, and go right back, often on their own planes. That means that they can change their residences and decrease New York's tax base in a heartbeat. There was a gentleman who lived in New Jersey who changed New York's tax base by $90 million when he moved out and moved to Florida.
David Tepper, right?
Exactly, a few years ago. So while there's got to be a shared sacrifice, and I implore even the wealthiest of us to be part of that shared sacrifice, they're not going to get talked into it if there are legislators who think that they're going to bear the entire brunt of this pandemic, because there aren't enough wealthy people between here and the planet Jupiter to actually pay those taxes.
Well, looking at the candidates for mayor, who would you consider at this point the favorites in the race? And do you have a horse in the race yet?
I don't have a horse in the race. Scott Stringer, who I practically grew up with in politics, he was the assemblyman in my state Senate district from 1992 until 2005 when he became borough president. I would see him as a little bit of a front runner because he doesn't have very much competition in the group that he's seeking votes from. Corey Johnson, the Speaker of the City Council, has gotten out of the race. And then you have three African-American candidates who want to run. One is Eric Adams, the very dynamic borough president of Brooklyn, former police captain, is a go-to person on issues of law enforcement and community, which we really need these days. But Eric will have a challenge within the Black community from Maya Wiley, who was counsel to the mayor, Patrick Gaspar, who was the national political director for President Obama, is her campaign manager. He's very close to the unions, Union Local 1199, Union Local 420, the Teachers Union, the Transport Workers Union. This is where most of the votes come from. And so you would have to give Maya Wiley an opportunity. And then there is Ray McGuire, who was the number 2 person at Citibank, at Citigroup, just stepped down, wants to run for mayor, has an incredible background starting in Dayton, Ohio, living almost in poverty, wound up going to Harvard Law School and getting a JD MBA, and a tremendous successfully driven businessman. But Ray hasn't had very much experience in a campaign format such as a primary, where many of the people who would support Ray may not even be voting in the primary. They may not be registered. So those are 4 of the candidates I think that are somewhat outstanding. There are some others, but it will be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Now let's turn to a very sensitive topic. Let's discuss race relations in this country. 1986, as a newly minted state senator, the racially charged Howard Beach murder case took place. And you began a long, tireless campaign to get a hate crime bill passed in New York. From the tragedies of Michael Griffith and Howard Beach in '86 to George Floyd in 2020, what has and hasn't changed in these past approximate 35 years?
I think what has changed is the understanding that there are hate crimes, which I don't think everybody wanted to really admit that was going on before. There have been some highly celebrated hate crimes in New York. There have also been situations involving interactions between a member of a minority group and the police that have been very difficult for the city and the state to address. One thing about the police department, the police in most neighborhoods who live there are not just police officers. They're the people who you bowl next to in the bowling alley. They're in the next lane. They're the people who are Cub Scout leaders and Little League coaches and deacons in their churches. So they rightly deserve the accolades they achieve because they go out and literally risk their lives every day. If you're trying to change police policy, you can't start by attacking the character of the entire police department that goes through that. At the same time, what people who live in a lot of these other neighborhoods don't understand is that the police were victimized in the same way that many people that did not know anything about minority communities were. They believed stereotypical points of view about young Black males, about all Black people or Hispanic people in general, and they practiced it often in those communities as officers, giving their precinct houses in certain neighborhoods nicknames like Fort Apache of the Bronx, which was a police precinct, the 44th, that had that nickname. The police officers gave it. It shows a total disrespect for the taxpayers that they are working for and creates an acrimonious situation between the police and the public. And what we've got to do is to get the public to understand how difficult it is to be a police officer with those split-second decisions that they make when they decide to draw their revolver, but also the police have to understand that their conduct, and I think New York City's police department has improved dramatically, with the exception of the stop and frisk free-for-all that Mayor Bloomberg led from 2009 to 2013, that the police department has tried to manage better in the inner cities around New York. But around the country, these are still circumstances that have not been resolved.
So Governor Patterson, I'll jump in for a moment there. Do we have a path forward for the safety of New York City? I can tell you personally, going into our Manhattan office feels very different today than it did 12 months ago. So aside from overreaching or broad-based police reform, which is necessary and sounds like quite challenging, as you just outlined, what are our next steps to make the city feel safe and make the corporate employees and the tourists and the rest of the base that really drives the life of the city come back?
Well, you're right. It is, it can feel like a ghost town at times. Nobody wants to ride the subway these days because of the feeling that you could catch the virus down there. There is, I think what's going to happen is that more people can start working again, using the restaurants. The more people there are actually in the streets will curtail a lot of this. Because of the ghost town atmosphere, you see homeless people now lining the streets at Times Square and other places where they weren't before. I think that's going to have to be addressed by the police department. And then I think overall, we have to have a policy that rewards what is peaceful protest when it is peaceful protest, but stops violence of any sort, whether it's looting, vandalism, attacking police officers or anybody else who might seemingly not have the right point of view to the attacker. And I think we're going to have to be very strong on both ends.
Thank you. Agreed.
I have one question. We have a large business audience that have joined us today. And I just wonder, what message, Governor, would you want to send to the business owners, the real estate owners, dealing with these COVID-imposed restrictions, which have devastated the restaurants, the hotels, and this already compounded by the repercussions of bail reform, the rent regulation reforms that were put into place, the higher taxes, and the SALT limitations. Like, could you give some encouragement to the owners that, you know, you got to stay the course, and what is the light at the end of the tunnel?
There was certainly a conduct in the bail system that was causing some people to be held, in one case, 2 years without getting a trial, and that poor young man committed suicide. That was the incident that inspired the Bail Reform Act. What happens sometimes when you have the same party having two majorities in the legislature is that the reform goes further than it actually should have. Now you have situations where people got arrested 6 times in a week and walked literally into the courthouse and right back out. They were probably in and out faster than the judges were. And there's going to have to be some presumptive legislation that pulls back on just this sort of situation we have now, where we're just throwing the doors open and allowing people to leave on bail when many of them still constitute a threat to society. The bail is not measured by the crime. It's measured by the ability to get the defendant into the courtroom to be at trial. But it does have an additional step, which is to make sure that this person is not a danger to society. So that's going to have to get cleaned up. The rent regulation reform was probably fine at the time that it was implemented earlier in the year. But what we're going to have now, if we don't watch it, is nobody's paying rent. So the landlords can't pay the banks. And when the landlords can't pay the banks eventually are going to go under. It's like that old adage: if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. And we are going to shake our economy to the core. If the banks start going down as they did in 2008, we're going to have widespread unemployment that really could go up to numbers rivaling the Great Depression. So we're going to have to gamble that we can put another stimulus package together to help these businesses and developers survive, because they're going to provide the broad tax base that we all are able to live off of.
Thank you, Governor. Before I turn it over to Carly for final remarks, I encourage all our viewers to go out and buy the governor's book, Black, Blind, in Charge. It's a very good, informative read, and it gives you really a history lesson over the course of his storied career. With that, thank you, Governor. And Carly, wrap it up for us.
Thank you, both of you, for sharing your thoughts. And yes, we have the link to purchase the book in the comment section below. So please click on that, make sure you read it. Fascinating information about the life and history of Governor Patterson. And any other questions for the governor or for Harry Dublinsky, feel free to reach out through YouTube or to any of us directly. We're happy to point you in the right direction. And thank you to Selman again and REDinNYC for putting these types of events together. Our full list of sponsors will also be listed in the comments. So please support the businesses that help keep New York businesses strong and further our industry of which we are all a part. Thank you, Governor, once again. Thank you, Harry, for joining us. We hope everyone has a great night. We hope to see you soon.
Selman, Yalcin, and Harry as well. It was great spending the time with you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Take care. Bye.